I too have been so moved by Rabbi Eliezer, and rabbis look for congregants for inspiration. And I hope you know this. Whenever we have the zechut to have you at the Bayit, I was so taken just by the way you carried yourself, watching you daven, watching you care. And aside from being such a brilliant teacher for SAR students, of course, Rabbi Eliezer is a switch hitter and is a phenomena in teaching students who don't have a Hebrew school, who don't have a yeshiva education. And so you were the prime teacher to many students out of public school, J-Space, the Jewish Youth Encounter Program. So grateful. And I know that Shani Rudensky is being honored at the dinner. I have memories of Shani when Toby and I would go to her Abba and Ima in South Carolina, in Charleston, when you were a little girl running around, and it's such a zechut, and to all of the honorees. And I see familiar faces. I see my Dan, whom I'm not afraid to use the L word. So I respect Dan, I love Dan. Right beneath the surface, he's all mush. He is. He's a beautiful man. And Zevi, it's so good to see you and all the familiar faces. And Binny, I feel such gratitude towards you for so many things. And I have such deep respect for you, for the leadership of SAR. And I say this wherever I go. For me, the greatest school I have ever seen worldwide is SAR, is the SAR Academy, and now the high school. Our daughters went to SAR. I wish our son had gone to SAR. Just thank you for everything. And for singling out Natan really is a testimony to who you are and the school is about. And I guess I'd want to dedicate this to your father. The night that Natan came out and he came to the Bayit, and we thought it would be a good idea for rabbis across the denominations to say a parak of Tehillim, because the battle to free Natan Sharansky wasn't an Orthodox battle. It was a Jewish battle. But there were Orthodox rabbis, I love them just the same, but didn't want to appear at the pulpit where a conservative or reform rabbi would also be offering a prayer. But I called your Abba, and that was one of the proudest moments when your Abba, tremendous Talmid Chacham, stood up and he read the Tefillot, and your Ima put in a plug for Yeshivat Marat. Your mother became like the aim of Yeshivat Marat, which, by the way, this past June graduated and gave smicha to its 100th woman. That deserves a round of applause. It was one of the great exodus movements of all of history. Sam. Family. The freedom of Soviet Jewry. From the time of the revolution, the communist revolution, Jews were denied the right to live as Jews in the Soviet Union and to emigrate to Israel. And as years went into decades, there were great heroes who rose within the Soviet Union. Boris Kocherbayevsky, who challenged the government and said, I wish to go to Israel even if it means walking by foot from Moscow. the great Yosef Mendeleevich, who tried to fly a plane to freedom. Ida Nudell, who hung a sign out of her window and said, "I am a Zionist." Each of these individuals were severely punished and spent, in Yosef's case, 11 years in the Gulag. And Ida too, and Boris too, spent time in that horror of horrors. In the West, when individuals, especially the great Yaakov Birnbaum of blessed memory, who rightfully should be called the father of the Soviet Jewry movement, when Yaakov heard of their plight, having lived through the Shoah and believing with all his heart and soul that as 6 million of our brothers and sisters were so brutally murdered that Jews in the West were too silent, he rose up and said, "We will never, ever make this mistake again." Indeed, there were many Jews, like myself, born at the tail end of the Shoah, reading books by Arthur Morse while 6 million died, or Elie Wiesel's The Jews of Silence, who resolved, "We are never again Jews. Never again will we be quiet as our brothers and sisters are in jeopardy." At the same time, there were activists who rose on the scene, like the person whom I call the tzaddik of the Soviet Jewry movement, Glenn Richter, who was influenced by the civil rights movement. He said, if Jews can stand up for our black brothers and sisters, certainly we should be able to stand up for ourselves. And it's often the case that it's easier to stand up for others than to stand up for ourselves. And so Glenn resolved that he would make a difference, that this would become our human rights cause. We would raise a voice for Soviet Jews. And on this day, when we celebrate the legacy of Martin Luther King, indeed, the Soviet Jewry movement was influenced, profoundly influenced by Dr. King. How were we influenced? Dr. King taught that to be a spiritual activist means that one stands up for a cause, not because it's necessarily popular, but because it's right. In the beginning of the civil rights movement, when he marched down south, even his brothers and sisters said, "Brother Martin, go home. You're a troublemaker." That's what Achav said to Eliyahu Hanavi. Here comes the Ocher Yisrael. I've learned what a zechut it is to be called a troublemaker. Martin Luther King went south when the civil rights movement was not a popular movement. But by and large, movements do not begin from the mainstream. The bureaucracy is too heavy. Virtually every movement begins from the fringe. Herzl was a fringe advocate. Lincoln was a fringe advocate to free the slaves. King was a fringe advocate, as were many in the leadership of the Soviet Jewry movement, living in the Soviet Union. And there's something else that Dr. King taught, that when one advocates, one can use all means at our disposal: lobby, political, judicial, and one could stand out in the streets and through a voice of faith, through a voice of moral clarity, demand equality, with one proviso: never, ever with violence. And that was the motto of the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, the first student organization that stood up nationally for Soviet Jewry. Those were the guidelines of Yaakov and Glenn, and the first chairman of the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, Rabbi Riskin, with the help of our own Rabbi Yitz Greenberg. Never use violence as a means of social action, because violence could hurt innocence, and violence undercuts the ethical holiness of the cause itself. And there's something else that Dr. King taught. This for me is most important. The true hero, the true leader, involved in a cause, as riveted as one may be in that cause, the test is, can I also embrace other causes, others who are in need? And all the way back in 1966, this is 5 years before there was a national federated conference on Soviet Jewry, Dr. King was asked to speak out on Soviet Jewry. And all of his advisors said, Martin, this is not the time. We are committed to our own cause. We have no time for others. But he did speak out. And I want to read to you what he said. These are his words. While Jews in Russia may not be physically murdered as they were in Nazi Germany, they are facing every day a kind of spiritual and cultural genocide. Negroes can well understand and sympathize with this problem. When you are written out of history as a people, when you are given no choice but to accept the majority culture, you are denied an aspect of your own identity. Ultimately, you suffer corrosion of your self-understanding and self-respect. And then he said, let us continue to make our voices heard and our righteous protests felt. We cannot sit complacently by the wayside while our Jewish brothers in the Soviet Union face the possible extinction of their cultural and spiritual life. Those who sit at rest while others take pains are tender turtles and buy their quiet with disgrace. Those who sit at rest while others take pains are tender turtles and buy their quiet with disgrace. It's a very major teaching. Chazal say, Kol hamitpalel bad chavero hu nene tchila. I remember when I was rolled in for open heart surgery, it's a moment, understandably, to think about one's own needs. But I thought about this rabbinic maxim. And at that moment, I started thinking about others who are not well, thinking of them. And this rabbinic teaching is not a kunz. If I think about you, so I'll be rewarded. No. When you're there for others, not even in your miskeret, it does something to the soul. It's uplifting. And so on this day, when we celebrate the life of Dr. Martin Luther King, we do remember the contribution that the civil rights movement made to the Soviet Jewry movement. What inspired that movement, to summarize, was the silence of the Shoah and watching how others stood up for their own freedom, and Jews stood up with them, declaring, we cannot do any less for ourselves. Now, of course, there were extraordinary Soviet Jews living in the Soviet Union who led the way. And probably the person amongst the many who is best known is Natan Sharansky. Now, why is he the best known? There were others. His story began as a love story which tugged at the hearts of Jews and those not of the Jewish faith alike. When Jerry Stern, a great philanthropist, took out full-page ads in America and around the country and told the story of Natan's marriage to Avital, the morning after they were wed, the KGB came to Avital and ordered her to leave the Soviet Union. She said, I can't leave without my husband. And they said, this is your only opportunity. And we commit ourselves that Natan will soon follow. And so she left. And she flew to Israel. And of course, the Soviets reneged on their agreement. And they were separated for more than 12 years before Natan experienced his freedom. That gripping love story planted the seeds. But there is another matter that few know that really catapulted Natan to the highest levels. And that is that Natan, in the spirit of Sakharov, was also a universalistic human rights advocate. In those days, there were a group of countries, including the Soviet Union, who signed a document committing themselves to human rights. And a Helsinki committee was created, led by Sakharov, and the spokesperson was Natan, who held the countries who had signed this agreement, held them to the word. And so when Natan said that the Soviet Union is violating that agreement, it became a universalistic cause, because the Soviets, in response, declared, of course Sharansky is saying that we are violating human rights because Sharansky is spying for the United States of America. And at that point, the President of the United States, who was then Jimmy Carter, rose up and mentions Sharansky's name to say it's not true. And so Natan reached the level of a human rights universalistic cause that went well beyond the Jewish community, that encompassed all of humankind. It was a microcosm of the Cold War going on between the United States and the Soviet Union. But here's what made Natan different. It's often the case that a universalist forgets his particularistic roots. It's true, Hillel says, Ulshani la'atzmi mo'ani. If I am only for myself, what am I worth? But that pitgam is preceded by im ein ani li mili. If I'm not for myself, what am I worth? And a cardinal rule of spiritual activism is the following, that a powerful sense of particularism does not contradict are universal responsibilities, but it is a prerequisite to it. A powerful sense of Leman Tzion Lo Echasher, a powerful sense of speaking out for Medinat Israel, does not contradict our broader responsibilities to Mishpachot Amim, but it precedes it. It's a prerequisite to it. This was Natan. And with a heavy heart, I tell you, our good friends in the Israeli government involved in Soviet Jewry days did not understand what I just shared with you. I'm not sure how I would share this with students, but the reality is they were not advocating for Sharansky the way they should have, because they felt his universalistic connection to Helsinki cut into the purity of his Zionistic aspirations. And there were battles that went on between the activist and that establishment. When we said the reverse, that speaks to his greatness. Natan would write letters to Avital, and Avital would study those letters over and over. Listen to this letter, which Natan wrote. This is a letter which Natan wrote, which Avital publicized in the Wall Street Journal. The words of Natan Sharansky. This great universalist speaks about particularism. In addition to Newton's law on the universal gravity of objects, there is also a law of the universal gravity of souls, of the bonds between them and the influence one soul has on the other. And it operates in this manner, that with each word that we speak and with each step that we take, we touch other souls, other Jewish souls, other universal souls, and have an impact on them. Why should I put this sin on my soul if I have already succeeded once in closing the gap between thoughts and words? How is it possible to take even one step backwards? I'm trying to give you a sense of the power of Sharansky. Not only being there for everyone, but being there for someone. I always get nervous when someone comes to me and says, Rabbi, you know I'm a good person. I love the whole world. It may take me a long time to say this. You know, on some level, it's easier to love the whole world. Because when you love everyone, you don't have to love anyone. The test of the way you love everyone is the way you love someone. The test of universalistic credentials is, where am I in that particularistic agenda? And when Natan, the background to this letter is he was told that if he will admit he was wrong, they'll free him. He said, for myself, that's something I can do. But if I say that, being part of the unity of Am Yisrael, even though it may be best for me, I'm hurting the larger cause. It's something that I can't do. Natan, the universalist, the particularist, again I say, who understood that the pathway to universal consciousness is a strong sense of Jewish identity. And beyond that, he's the real deal. You'd think that a person like this is like in the clouds. He's funny. Don't go one-on-one with Natan's sense of humor. They once asked him, when you were coming across that bridge from West Germany to East Germany, from East Germany to West Germany, what you were thinking, what lofty thoughts of love for Avital who was waiting for you. He said, you know, they didn't want me to wear prison pants, so they gave me pants, and it didn't fit. They were too large. And when I was looking at these cameras, he says, with a twinkle in his eye, I just offer the prayer, dear God, please make sure my pants don't fall down. This is Natan Sharansky. I was with him once, taking him back to an airport, and a Yid comes up to him. This is just a few months after he was freed, his first visit to America. And this Yiddilah comes up to him and said, Sharansky, give me a bracha. Natan says, what's going on, Avi? I said, this man wants a blessing from you. So I said, Natan, you're a Hasidic Rebbe. He said, you don't understand. I'm not the rabbi. He's the rabbi. Who'll give you a blessing? The man said, I recognize this rabbi. Those were my activist days. I have no interest in his blessing whatsoever. I want a blessing from you, and I'm telling you, if you don't give me a blessing, you're not going to get on your plane. So I said, Natan, you may have beaten the KGB. He always said he knew what to do with the KGB. If they said go straight, he went zigzag, that famous story. But this Yiddilah you're not going to beat. He said to me, he was a greenhorn then, how do I do it? I said, you put your hands on his head, and you say a bracha. Puts his hands on his head, so help me. Closes his eyes, and he says, Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu melech haolam, hamotzi lecha min haaretz. We rabbis, we look for brachas to give to our bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah. The next Shabbat, we had a bar mitzvah. I said, hamotzi lecha min haaretz. It didn't work out that well. He's real. When he came off the plane, I tell you this with great emotion, his first words were, I'm here, but I will not forget the hundreds of thousands of Jews that I left behind. That's Natan Sharansky. And he could have rested on his laurels, on the heroism in the Gulag. But then he enters into the Knesset. And he leaves the Knesset on 2 occasions. He leaves because of his integrity. He just felt, I'm willing to give up power to be honest with myself. And then he spends another 9 years in the Jewish Agency, where everybody has an opinion. And he sits and he tries not only to hear what others are saying, but to listen to what they're saying. And you know what his greatest accomplishment was? His family. You'll meet Rachel. You know, when he was freed and Avital was then a shomeret mitzvot, you know the joke that was going around? Will she take off her covering on her head first, or will he put on his yarmulke first? Which one? I don't live with them, but they have a romantic marriage and their love for their children. And in the end, that's the test. Take it from me. As one is an activist who too often I didn't give enough time to my children. Take it from me. What counts most, what's so central, are the kids. I remember taking our Dina to SAR, and my mind was on 100 different things. I thought I was important, how mistaken I was. And Dina's babbling away, and I'm driving. And suddenly she says to me, Rabbi. I stopped the car. I say, Dina, then, I'm your Abba. Why'd you call me Rabbi? And she's permitted me to tell this story. She said, Abba, I've been calling you Abba, Abba, Abba. I got no response. I said, Rabbi, I got a response. On Natan's level, he's all the way up there. Wow. One more step. There's another reason why we know Natan Sharansky more than anyone else. This February 11th, 1986, Bet Adar Aleph, actually the Sharanskys celebrate the Hebrew date of the release. That's when they have a Sudat Hoda'ah. We know Natan in ways we didn't know any other prisoner of Zion through Avital. It was her demand for his freedom, the way she carried herself. Through her, we came to know him. And so as you celebrate Natan's release, this is a time to celebrate the person whom I consider the most important activist of the latter part of the 20th century. If I were asked who was the most important activist, it would be Avital Sharansky. What was her greatness? She is the epitome of one of my favorite Gemaras, B'makom gedulato sham anvitanuto. Do you know where there's real greatness? There's greatness where there is humility. She carried herself. She still carries herself. As Rav Binny said, there are no heroes today. She was talking about herself. That's how you know she is a hero. She's a hero's hero. And she was, during the days of separation, Natan, very inspired by Mussar Rav Kook. And she became a person of tremendous spiritual depth. You know, when you're speaking at a rally, you got to be in the rhythm of the rally. Never did she speak that way. Every word that she spoke, every word had its spiritual meaning. Let me just read to you just a small piece. This is what she said at a Solidarity Day in front of hundreds of thousands. No cliche calls. This is what she said about freedom. All of us recognize the importance of human freedom, man's God-given basic right. Today, as we identify with Anatoly Sharansky, let us know the importance of freedom as a prisoner sees it, not as a faraway ideal, not as a formula learned from a textbook, but as part of life itself. That part of life taken brutally away. It is much like an iron door closes shut on a windowless room whose ceiling is so low that it is impossible to stand on one's own 2 feet. This is freedom to Anatoly Sharansky, the right to open the iron door, to join his family, to receive the medical care he desperately needs, the right to love a wife and to build a home. There can be no other freedom as long as there is no freedom for Anatoly Sharansky. There can be no world freedom as long as the iron door in Chistopol prison remains shut. Those are deep thoughts. For a shiur, they can be studied. It's like the writings of Rav Kook. That's the way she spoke. And she was the real deal. She could be very, very funny. Sometimes so naive she didn't understand how out of place she was. I remember at a parlor meeting in Cleveland at Sam Miller's home. Sam Miller of blessed memory is Aaron Miller's father, the Aaron Miller who does all the commentary for the last umpteen years on what's going on in the Middle East. It was a parlor meeting in his father's home, and his father invited all of the co-owners of the Cleveland football Browns. And it was swanky of swank. Trafe of trafe, but swanky of swank. Everybody decked out, and there stood Avital, beautiful outside and inside, wearing her shoes that had no heels. And she looked, and she started talking about how they want to make deals with Natan, which is going to really compromise what he's all about, his freedom. And when they approached me and said that they want to make those deals, she looks up and she says, I can't say it, she says, bull. Oh my God. It was like, this pure, holy lady, she said, bullshit? I mean, that's what she said. When we got into that limos for us, I said, אביטל, את יודעת מה שאת אמרת? זה הלכלוך של פרה. Oh, באמת? I remember when she got up on 67th Street after Brezhnev died. She gets up. And she just had this way. She said, do you know why Brezhnev died? He didn't free my husband. I'm telling Andropov, if he doesn't free my husband, he's going to drop dead. I walk up to Avital. I say, Avital, that, that's so fundamentalist. What are you doing? Says, a year later, we're in the same spot, same place. She says, I warned Andropov. I told him if he wouldn't free my husband, he'd die. And he died. Now, I am warning Kosygin. The same thing will happen to him. I said, Avital, one time you get away with it, but twice? So help me. A year later, she's in the same spot. She says, I told Kosygin. I told him. He didn't free my husband. He's dead. I'm warning Gorbachev. If he doesn't free my husband, he's going quick. I'm warning Gorbachev. And for years, if you would ask Avital why Gorbachev is still alive, she would tell you, he freed my husband. She was a beloved figure. What a zchut it was to accompany her throughout America. She was always accompanied by someone from Israel, Merkaz Rav Kook, and in different countries by different people. Just one moment when we landed in Toronto, this is now in the early 80s, she's still advocating, and a young woman walks up to her with a little child. She first says to me, can I approach Avital? I said, she's the most approachable person. She approaches her, and she says, I want to introduce you to my daughter. Her name is Avital. I named her in your honor. Odds are that women who are 40 years old today, called Avital, were named in honor of Avital Sharansky. There you have it. How the civil rights movement, how the Shoah inspired the movement to free Soviet Jews. A little bit of the glimpse of the story of Natan Sharansky and the great, great Avital Sharansky. And some suggestions, humble suggestions, as you go forward to teach about the Sharanskys and the larger Soviet Jewry movement. There should be curriculums that deal with this movement. Our youngsters should know the names of these heroes. The Boris Kochabayevskys, the Mark Dimschitzes, the Silva Zalmansons, the Anatoly Altmans, the Ida Nudels, the Joseph Beguns. It's important that they know their names. These are heroes in our midst. And it's important that they know about the junior partners in the West. We in the West were junior partners. They were the senior heroes. When we went to a rally, we knew we were coming home. When they went to a rally, you never know. You never know if they were coming home. And some of those heroes created SAR. I mentioned Yitz Greenberg. Yitz was involved way before I was. He deserves the credit. Jackie Bentheim, president of SAR. The first large rally for Soviet Jewry in Madison Square Garden would never have happened without Jackie. He was the one who guaranteed the money, frankly. Never would have happened without Jackie. He has that in his pocket forever and ever. Ludwig Jesselson. You will know that name, or you should know that name. He built SAR. Avital once went to him and needed help and asked him for $50,000. They had a plan. She had a plan of some kind, exchanging a spy from South Africa for Natan. And Ludi looks at Avital and says, I don't think it can work. I'm not going to give you the money. And she walked out crying. She's going down the hall. And Avital told me, suddenly, Ludi Jesselson is running after her and says, I just can't allow you to leave this way. Come back into the office. You asked for 50, I'll give you 100. In the end, Ludi was right. It didn't work. And Avital asked us, well, halachically, do I have to return the money I didn't use? I said, I think so. And though she went to Ludi, and Ludi said, once I give, I don't take back. These are heroes. Rabbi Charles Shear, who headed the educational committee for many years, was the chaplain. These names should be known here in Manhattan, Rabbi Lookstein, all over the country. These were the junior partners of the senior movement. That's the first thing. That's the first thing they should know. That's the first thing they should know. And the second thing young people should know is the following. All great movements for freedom invariably follow the line of the Navi in Yeshayahu who says, V'na'ar no hegotam. It's young people who make the difference. In this book, which I think is going to be given out as a gift, you turn to page 191, and you're going to see a picture of when the front of the Soviet building over here, the Soviet residence, was renamed. The street was renamed Sharansky Street. And there is the borough president, Stanley Simon, who deserves credit, standing up there. And there is this one kid who's standing almost on his level with hands up like this. It's none other than Rabbi Binning. Young people who lead the way, they can make a difference. You know, people have often asked, they say things like, when will we see the Soviet Jewry movement again? When will we see young people gathering together united? With all of the darkness of the past 2 years, it's been a remarkable time. Young people have stepped up. Graduates of SAR have joined the IDF. Others, graduates, serving the way they're serving. I hadn't seen pictures of prisoners of Zion and shuls, that kind of thing in years, but in the past 2 years, pictures of hostages. We saw young people lead the way. And finally, it's so important to empower our youngsters. Most youngsters don't believe in themselves enough. Maybe outwardly, they look like they're sure of themselves. But inwardly, there could be an insecurity. And I believe it's important to, in a proper way, empower them. For everyone to understand, every child to understand, they can make a difference. They can dance, they can sing as no one else can dance and sing. Obviously, we need everyone together to make the difference. But each individual can make the difference. Like the Rambam says, the world is on an even scale. The next act, the next good act can make the difference. It's my favorite activist story about this Rebbe who was able to answer any question, but he comes into this room like this one, and there's a young girl in the back of the room, and she takes a little bird the size of a butterfly in her hands and says, "Tell me, Rebbe, is this bird alive or is it dead?" And she says, "You know, if he says the bird is dead, I'll open my hands. The bird will live and fly freely. If he says it's dead, if he says it's alive, I'll close my hand and I'll kill the bird." And according to the Midrash, the philosopher looks out after being stumped, says, "You're holding a little bird in your hands. You're asking if it's alive or dead. I can only tell you this. The fate of this bird lies in your hands." Every child everyone has to understand, with humility, everyone can make a difference. Everyone. You know, there are questions in the Torah that have no answer. No answer. One of the questions was when Yosef reveals himself to his brothers, and he says, Ani Yosef, ha'od avichai, I'm Yosef. Is my father still alive? And the Torah says, V'lo yachlu lanot oto. There was no response. Whenever you have a question in the Torah with no response, it means the whole Torah is the response. All of Jewish history is the response. And we heard the response in the Soviet Jewry movement to the question, Ha'od avichai. We stood up using the nigun of Reb Shlomo, and we called out, O Davinu Chai, Am Yisrael Chai. That's the moment that is before us now as we celebrate the 40th year. This is a moment to do all we can to tell our youngsters they can make that difference. They can call out powerfully, O Davinu Chai, O Davinu Chai, O Davinu, O Davinu, O Davinu Chai. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai.